And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. On our program today, we're going to be talking about poetry with West Virginia resident and poet Sarah Chavez. Sarah joins us today, and she was born and raised in the California Central Valley. She's the author of the chapbook All Day Talking from Dancing Girl Press, which was published in 2014, a selection of which won the 2013 Susan Addifat Peckham Fellowship, and Hands That Break and Scar from Sundress Publications, which came out in 2017. Her manuscript, This Like So Much, was an honorable mention for the 2013 Quercus Review Press Poetry Book Contest, and she was named one of the 2016 Top 10 New Latino Authors to Watch and Read by LatinoStories.com. Chavez earned a Ph.D. in English with a focus in poetry and ethnic studies from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her work, which often foregrounds issues of ethnicity and gender, can be found or is forthcoming in North American Review, The Fourth River, Luna Luna Magazine, So to Speak, Feminist Journal of Language and Art, among other journals and anthologies. She is currently a visiting assistant professor of English at Marshall University, where she also serves as the coordinator for the A.E. Stringer Visiting Writers Series, and she's a proud member of the Macondo Writers Workshop. And we're pleased to have Sarah Chavez with us here today to talk to us about her newest collection of poetry, Hands That Break and Scar. So Sarah, welcome to Chapters. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So tell me a little bit about how you got interested in writing, and particularly how you got interested in working with poetry.
I think about that pretty frequently because it's a common question, and especially like we were talking a little bit ago, coming from a working class background, I mean, to think about oneself as a writer and specifically to think about yourself as a poet seems kind of unimaginable. And so when I was a kid, I read a lot, and I had a number of I had one really good friend actually who wanted to be a novelist, and I was like, well, that's silly, but I like you and we're good friends, and she wrote these really amazing things, and she started writing them about people we knew, and so we actually started writing limericks about people we knew that were not nice limericks. They were like limericks. They were gross and, and weird. And so, but it was so satisfying to do that. And it was this thing that we could bond over. And I really never saw writing as something that I would do as a profession, or I never really thought about publishing, but I knew that I loved it and I knew that I needed to do it. And so when I was in college is when I took a poetry workshop just to see, and my teacher was really encouraging, and they said, well, you should take another workshop, and I did, and then they were really encouraging, and so it kind of went on like that. And when I graduated, I was like, well, I need a job where I make money because I've been broke and a college student for 4 years now. And so I went and did other things for 2 years and thought, you know what, I really miss this and I miss having that community. So I enrolled in graduate school, and since then is when I've really started to kind of think of myself as a writer and to kind of commit to the genre of poetry, because I had already been sort of gravitating towards that in my personal life, and then so it seems like the natural fit for me.
So how did you gravitate from California all the way to West Virginia? I know you mentioned you went to graduate school. We talked about you getting your Ph.D. at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Mm-hmm. So you migrated across the country, stopped in Nebraska, but kept on coming. So what brought you to West Virginia from California?
Well, actually, there's a little step in between, because my partner and I were both applying for programs at the same time, and we thought, well, we'll just go to the first place that takes both of us. So we kept getting accepted, but one of us would get accepted, and so finally the first place that accepted both of us was in Indiana. So we moved to Indiana, and then I got my PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I was graduating, and I needed a job. And so I was on the job market, and one of the professors here actually is an alumna of UNL, and he was a good friend of mine. His name Dr. Cody Lumpkin, and he was like, oh, hey, there's a job opening up. And so I was like, you know what? I've never been to West Virginia. That sounds kind of cool. So we applied, and both my partner and we both got hired. And it was, I mean, to have us both hired, like, clearly had to happen. So
Yeah, very good.
So that's how we made it here.
Well, we're certainly glad to have
Thank
you.
you.
And I'll come back. There's a question I want to ask you about your California connection to West Virginia in just a little bit. But as we get into your new collection here, Hands That Break and Scar, how did this collection come about? How long did you work on this collection? And was this a situation where you had sort of a smattering of poems out there and then you added more to it? Or did you know starting out this was going to be a collection that you were going to put together?
I didn't actually. What's funny is some of these, because California is so big. Like, California is so big, and my family is very big in personality. And so I never really thought about myself outside of those things. I certainly never thought about any states outside of California. I mean, all of our vacationing happened within 7 to 8 hours of where we lived, which is still inside California. So it wasn't until I moved to Indiana that it was interesting, because I was there for poetry, and I was trying to write about moving there. I was trying to write about, like, experiencing snow for the first time and all of these things that were very different, and these poems were terrible. And my teacher sort of like, oh yeah, I mean, like, yeah, you know how to turn a phrase, but and so I finally I was really missing home, and I wrote about that experience, something from home. And that was the first time in graduate school that someone was like, I think you're on to something. And so I wrote, a few of these are from my master's thesis. That was a creative thesis at Ball State University. And then when I went to UNL, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew that my dissertation would be a collection of poems with a theoretical introduction. And so I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to write the things that are occupying my mind and hope that it comes together. And it did. I think one of the things that is hard to do as a writer is, especially as a poet, is a lot of people will create towards something, but I was just trying to trust myself. And I mean, I think I got about 3/4 of the way, and I'm like, okay, like, this is a thing. And then it got a lot more mindful after that, in terms of filling in maybe gaps and figuring out, like, what should the other quarter of this be, kind of thing. So it really is. Some of these poems are as old as my early days in grad school, and some of them were as new as the year before I graduated. So that's like a 7-year span almost.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So a little bit of older stuff mixed with some contemporary stuff to pull the collection together. Very good.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you. There's so many great poems in here, and I wish we had time to talk about them all. But I wanted to ask you about one poem that I really, really liked, and that was called "Running Into Things." And there's a little bit of irony in this poem, but it really centers on an uncle's drunk driving accident. Can you tell us a little bit about that poem and kind of what's going on in that poem?
So this poem is funny to me because this is the very first poem I ever had published ever. I never tried to publish my work. I hadn't published before I applied to graduate school the first time. And then when I was telling my advisor, when I was getting ready to graduate from the master's, I was like, yeah, maybe I want to do a PhD. I don't know. And he was like, yeah, you should actually, they were not going to take you unless you publish things. And I was like, oh, that's right. Like, this is supposed to lead to them becoming public. Sure. And so, I was really lucky. I sent out, I think, 4 submissions, and one of them got picked up, which is statistically, like, amazing. And it was, I'll tell the short version. So that poem was published, and I sent the link to my mom because she said she wanted to read it. I went home to visit, and she was very friendly. Everything was normal. We went to a restaurant, and then she laid into me. She's like, she's going to watch this too. How could you air our family's dirty laundry in public like this? And it was so fascinating because to me the poem is funny. I think it's heartbreaking, but it's also funny if we can't laugh at those heartbreaking things in life. I don't, you can't get through it. You can't like work around it. And so it was just this interesting quirk that I thought deserved like the sort of ego and that addiction can do. Like addiction can block all of these not just social receptors, but like sense of self, and it was just fascinating because it was this really interesting tick that he had. He just liked to drive into stuff, and he almost never got hurt, thank God. But there's a lot of property damage, and in fact, what happens in the poem is not exactly what happens in real life. I mean, so it's not. Some of it is very much based on real situations, but I think it's important to keep the poem in mind, that it's not creative nonfiction or autobiography. I really write from a personal place, but ultimately I want to serve the poem. So what do these images need to be? What order do things need to happen in? And so, but I love my uncle, but he's also, driving into stuff. So.
Has this other side to him that needs to be written about. Very good.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about another poem that I really liked, Neighborhood Watch, because it goes to what you were saying a moment ago about running into things. Mm-hmm. It takes a relatively serious issue or a sensitive issue or sensitive topic, but kind of approaches it in a lighthearted manner. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in Neighborhood Watch, because when I saw that title immediately, I thought, ooh, I know what a Neighborhood Watch is. I've got one in my neighborhood. I had one in my neighborhood growing up, but your Neighborhood Watch is a little different. So tell us a little bit about that Neighborhood Watch and that poem.
I've never been part of a real Neighborhood Watch, like an organized one. I moved into my own apartment really early when I was like around right when I turned 19, and from the moment I got there was this one neighbor who he sort of worked for himself, and he was on disability, and he was ex-Marine, and he was just like this really cool, interesting person, and he made sure that he knew what was going on all the time, because we lived in a really high crime neighborhood, and cars got stolen, bikes got stolen, people got stabbed, like things happened. And so, and he and I became friends. And so it really was this sense of community that like it was a relatively small apartment complex, and we did know everyone, even if we didn't really know them. And there was this sense of looking out for one another. And I think that's something that's so important, as particularly in working class neighborhoods and in low income neighborhoods, because the police aren't going to get there very quickly. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times in those neighborhoods, it's not someone coming in because they know you have money. It's like domestic violence and things related to addiction. And so this sort of, it was this like sort of loving vigilance that I really appreciated, and sort of felt like I learned from this neighbor. And so we would just kind of sit out there and just pay attention, and and tell each other like, I saw someone came in really late last night, or I didn't recognize that car. And so it's something that I really value and actually miss about that neighborhood, was the level of connection and community support.
Yeah. One of the interesting themes that kind of runs through a lot of your poems in your collection is this idea of working class, as you talked about, and there's a lot of images of childhood and a lot of voices and I don't want to say characters, but people speaking in the poems who seem like they're children, or you're looking back on that childhood experience. And we get a sense that sometimes childhood in California is rough, that this is a rough experience. I'm wondering, now that you've been in West Virginia for a while and have worked with and met a lot of Appalachians and worked with young people at Marshall who come from rural areas and sometimes are maybe the first person in their family to go to college, first person to get out of the small town in which they're from. Do you see any parallels or similarities from those kinds of kids that you're writing about and those experiences that you remember and the kids you're working with now?
Absolutely. That's actually been one of my ins, because, I am very other for a number of reasons in term, like a lot of the students have never met a Latina. Some of them, they're like, my teacher has a nose ring, that's weird. And because there are these very specific tropes that if you don't come from a family that goes to college, and I had those tropes too. I felt very skeptical of my young professors when I was in college. Like, I'm not getting somehow people are tricking me. Like, I'm not getting my money's worth here. And I feel so bad for that first teacher that I was mean to. But one of the things that I think was really helpful was being able to share that it's not the same, because mine was an urban, so lower socioeconomic space, but a lot of the problems that the students are having, like not having time to complete their homework because they have two jobs, needing to go home to care for an ill parent or a parent who's on disability, having children, being very young and having a child, like all of those things are things that I am familiar with. And so I think that having my own reference point to understand being in that situation and being able to share with them a little bit about, like, no, like, I get it, like, let's figure out a way for us to still recognize the issues that are going on at home, but then to also prioritize your education, because ultimately that's what you're there for. And so that's been really helpful, and I think because of the kinds of classes I teach, to sort of share that little bit of my background has been a point where we can sort of connect initially, where there seems like maybe there won't be as much connection, but then it turns out there really is.
Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting, too, despite the fact that you've got some children or some young people going through some precarious situations at times in your poem, there's a moment of grace and kind of joy that's sort of found in these ordinary experiences, particularly the interactions that some of your characters have in the poems. Is that something connected to your experiences growing up, or are those sort of themes or motifs that just kind of came about as you were putting the poems together?
I would actually say a little bit of both. One of the reasons I wanted to do the PhD to begin with, because you can get a terminal degree in creative writing that's non-academic, but I really wanted that academic part, because I wanted time to like read and think analytically about the kind of literary tradition I'd be going into, because the Central Valley actually has this really fascinating history of producing creative writers, but they're primarily male, they're primarily white, and so it's a really fascinating dynamic. And so I read a lot of the Chicano Central Valley writers during my program, and I realized that there's a hole there, that there needs to be sort of like other versions of this, because the Central Valley is where about 80% of all like produce comes from. A lot of it looks at farming and being in rural spaces, when actually such a huge part of it is urban. And so I did think a lot about urban working class spaces, and I did think a lot about work and jobs. That's a theme that's in a lot of Chicano poetry, and it's in a lot of working class poetry. And one of the things that struck me about poetry that looks at working class situations, Jim Daniels comes to mind, Philip Levine comes to mind, Jan Beatty, who's actually in Pittsburgh. There's this sense of community that's there. And so I really wanted to think about these experiences that I'd had as a child and look for that magic, that connection that I knew was there, because it almost has to be there for survival. And unfortunately, a lot of times in this working class poetry, it's coming at it from a Marxist perspective and less of an emotional perspective. And so I wanted to come out of it like, look at the good things that come out of this. Look at the kind of personal connections you can make.
Yeah, and I probably should have asked this sooner, but geographically speaking, Central Valley, California, where is that in the state, and what are maybe some landmarks that folks in our audience could maybe identify with in terms of where that is located within the state?
So if you look at a map, it is literally the very center of the state, like very center, going north and south and east and west. It's I jokingly say it's like a slightly smaller LA with less culture, because it's really big. There's a lot of people. There's over 500,000 people there in Fresno. I'm talking about Fresno specifically. And it's incredibly diverse. So a lot of times, if you look at the produce in the store, if it doesn't say like from Mexico, it's probably from a farm out there. In terms of a landmark, it's sort of inland from Yosemite, and it's 2 hours south of San Francisco and 4 hours north of LA.
Okay. So you really are right in the middle of the
Yeah,
state.
literally in the middle of the state.
Very good, very good. Another poem I wanted to ask you about, getting back to some of the individual poems, 13 and Catholic, which I thought, I'm not Catholic, but I know how, remembering 13-year-olds and knowing 13-year-olds and how they look at religion, regardless if they've been brought up in a church or with a faith, or they're just kind of getting new to it or used to it. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in that poem, because that was one of my favorites too, that really connected with me. So what's going on in 13 and Catholic?
So the plot of 13 and Catholic is that there is, a Catholic teenager and who's sort of like making out with another teenager for maybe, I guess you could sort of imply that it's the first time, because it starts to move past just kissing. And I did grow up Catholic, and I went to Catholic school. And I remember a conversation we had with one of our teachers where she was trying to talk about sin. And we were like, okay, but when is it a sin? Is it a sin like if you're over the clothes? Is it a sin if like, you've got like something taken off? And she was just shaking her head. And she's like, if you're asking the question, you have sinned. And I always thought that was hilarious. And so, because that was the kind of bargaining that I think a lot of kids do. Like, I know this, someone told me this was wrong, but I want to do it, and I don't know why it's wrong. And so that I thought that was something about being a kid and being Catholic that I thought was really funny and maybe doesn't get talked about as much. That kind of bargaining we do with organized religion, and for, like, well, why can't I do this thing that the priest told me was bad?
Which I think is very, and it reminded me of, they were going kind of, I'm thinking, ooh, are they going to get to first base? Are they going to get to second base?
Right.
We go through those bases, the baseball analogy.
Right,
How far does it go?
Exactly.
So, but it was a great poem. I loved
thank
it.
you.
Another poem I wanted to ask you about, because I love what you do here with an old story that we're familiar with, is, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Quinceanera? Quinceanera, very good.
Yeah.
And I love how you start that poem, because you write, Maria looked like a brown Cinderella as the jeweled hem of her blue satin gown skimmed the floor of the VFW hall on Belmont. So we have so many images here, that idea of Cinderella and what we know of Cinderella, but here's Maria. She's got the jeweled hem. She's obviously dark complected, unlike Cinderella from the story. But how you take such an ordinary experience and you put Maria in a VFW, which we all kind of have, which is definitely not the palace of the ball.
No, it's not.
But I love that poem, and I loved it because I felt like I knew what I was seeing, I knew what was going on, and it was just so well written. So tell us a little bit about that poem, because I really loved that.
That poem is really. I actually wrote that poem was really hard for me to write, partly because I had wanted a quinceañera, but because of the sort of like being half white and living primarily with my mom is white, my dad is Mexican American. There was just sort of never the conversation about it, but I went to my friends' quinceañeras, and even though I was always a little more on the tomboy side, the idea of being Cinderella it wasn't that part that appealed to me, but it really is this beautiful ceremony where it's the celebration of womanhood, and I love that in Mexican American culture, it's sort of the equivalent of like a debutante ball. It's there's dancing, and this person, there's actually a mass that goes with it, a Catholic mass, and no matter how poor you are, and that's part of the poem, right, is that there's 98-cent store centerpieces, and it's happening at the VFW where it's going to be very cheap to rent.
Yes.
Because these things, these passages of childhood are so expensive. They can be, and there's this pressure to make them expensive. And so I love how even in working class neighborhoods, people find a way to make those moments special, even if it means, say, cutting corners in a way that another family doesn't have to do. And also 15 is just such an awkward, like, you really are in that in between. And so
and Maria still gets, like you said, Maria still gets that experience,
Yeah.
even if it was the 98-cent decorations.
Absolutely.
And she's at the VFW, she gets that experience of kind of being the star of the ball and having that whole experience.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you, what are you working on next? Are you working on another collection? Are you sending some poems out individually? Where are you in the writing process, and what are you working on next?
Yes, to sort of all the above. I am sending out some poems individually. I have a collection I'm working on and a series of poems that I'm working on that are a little bit different. I have a hard time sticking to one thing, so I kind of, as I think of things, I try to like work a little bit in each one. But so my chapbook, All Day Talking, is a collection of epistles that are also elegies from a singular speaker to a woman that she loves who has died. And I really kind of got like obsessed with those poems, and I ended up, after publishing the chapbook, writing a lot more. And so it just I woke up one day and realized, like, oh, I'm almost to a collection here. So that's one that's really, really close to being sent out. It's almost ready to get shopped around. And then the series I'm working on is a series of poems that are it's a re-envisioning of the Native American myth regarding the turtle who carries the earth. That's a myth that's in almost all indigenous tribal cultures. And what I like about that story, so just very quickly, like, there's no land, and so the turtle has to keep going under and under the water and bringing up more land so that other animals can be on land and breathe and not just be sort of like floating in the air or swimming. And so it just seemed like such a lonely job that here he is carrying everyone, like literally without the sacrifice, no one can live. And so I've always wondered about what that felt like. Is he happy to do it? Is he forced to do it? I don't know why I think of him as a he, but I do. Maybe that's really gendered. And so these poems are, there's actually two sets. There's a set that's before he carries the earth, like my sort of re-envisioning of his interactions with other animals, and then there's after he carries the earth for millennia and he comes back in present day, and he's sort of like, whoa, what have you people what have you done here? There's a poem that got published that I like reading in February because it's Turtle's first Valentine's Day.
Oh, very good.
And so he gets to eat chocolate.
All right. Which is a good thing no matter
Right?
who you are, what species
Exactly.
you are. Absolutely.
Exactly.
So, Sarah, in our final moments with you today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about Hands That Break and Scar or about poetry in general, how can they get in contact with you, and where can they get a copy of your book?
So if they would like to get in contact with me, I am online. I have Twitter, I have Instagram. Probably the easiest way is to go to my website. It's literally my name, sarahchavez.com. Also, I can be, a lot of the A.E. Stringer stuff is public, so if you sort of Google that, my name will pop up. But the book, you can buy the book off of my website. You can also buy it from Sundress Publications website. They're a wonderful press. I would recommend to anyone to check them out. And then I believe it might be carried locally. So for people who are local, I know Make Art Gallery was going to carry it, and probably other stores soon. But yeah, it's at this point definitely online for sure.
Good. Sarah Chavez has been our guest today. We've been talking to her about her life, her career as a writer and as working in academia, but also her fantastic new collection of poems, Hands That Break and Scar. And Sarah, it's a fantastic collection, and I would encourage anyone to read it. But if you're worried about approaching poetry because you think, well, I'm not a poetry person, don't know, can't connect, whatever, it's a great way to get into poetry. A fantastic collection, really enjoyed it, and thanks for coming on to Chapters to talk about it.
Thank you so much for chatting with me.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and pick up a copy of Sarah Chavez's book, or remind you that many of the other authors, editors, and publishers that we featured on the program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square and pick up a copy of Sarah's book or any other author that you've seen featured here on the program, because their works are for sale right here at Empire Books and News. And if you want to stay in contact with the program and interact with us on social media, we've made that possible for you as well. The first way to do that is through our email address, which is right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. Please put your name and the community or town in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. If you like to watch old programs of Chapters, we've made that available to you through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. Once you enter that information, find the Chapters tab, and from there we've got all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And if you like Facebook, we have a Chapters page on Facebook, and that address is here also at the bottom of the screen. Our more recent episodes of the program are archived there on Facebook, but you can chat and interact with people who view the program, share those programs onto your Facebook page, and send that around social media. So if you like Facebook, you like YouTube, you like email, we've made it possible for you to stay in contact with the program. We know many of you have, and we appreciate those comments and feedback so very much. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.